are communities that are still hunter-gatherers, and the Hadza in northern Tanzania are one such population. And this is a paper published in 1962. And I was looking for, so what do the children of the Hadza hunters get fed? Because it's not cereal from Woolworths. It has to be something else. Infant feeding was rendered soft fat as from the zebra, and bone marrow, both raw and cooked, are introduced in the early months. So the child is weaned onto fat from the zebra and the bone marrow. When the infant has 2 to 4 teeth, pre-chewed meat, so the mother pre-chews the meat, she's then fed, and by the age of about 18 months, the full adult range of foods will be consumed. So they will eat the meat, but they'll also eat some of the carbohydrate sources that are available. And so then the question was, well, how healthy were these children? And the main finding were the good health of the children in general, and particularly the absence of obvious malnutrition and anemia, were probably related to the excellent infant feeding patterns based on prolonged breastfeeding and the introduction of animal protein in the second 6 months of life in the shape of bone marrow and pre-chewed meat. So that's it, and that's how we've survived for 2.5 million years or so, eating these foods. And those are the foods that both the dietary guidelines for South Africa and in our books we propose. We've been eating this food for millions of years, and if we hadn't weaned our children onto these foods, humans wouldn't exist. Infants were randomized to either pureed beef or iron-enriched infant cereals as the first complementary food, and they noticed that the mean daily zinc intake from the complementary foods for the infants in the meat group was 1.9 milligrams compared to 0.6 milligrams in the cereal group, which is approximately 25% of the average daily requirement. And then they noticed that the increase in head circumference for infants aged 7 to 12 months was marginally greater in the meat group. Zinc and protein intake was a predictor of head growth. And we're going to come back to this. That first 1,000 days are so crucial, that the child must have the nutrients it needs to develop its brain. And we're going to discuss the evidence at the end of 12 months. If you measure the child's head circumference, you can predict to some extent its future intellectual growth. And that's frightening. If our intellectual growth is determined at 12 months, and it's determined by the quality of the food that we gave the child, and particularly whether that child had enough zinc and iron and other brain-specific nutrients to develop the brain during this period of explosive brain growth. And they noticed then that as breast milk is generally a more abundant source of fat than most complementary foods, total fat intake often decreases as the contribution of breast milk to total dietary energy declines. And this raises the question, why does breast milk have so much fat in it? Why does breast milk have so much fat in it? And the answer is because the baby needs that fat to develop its brain. And once you start cutting the fat, you can expect that the brain growth will not be as good as it should be. And so again, I make the point that the neonate is different from all other ages because the need for fat to grow the brain is so enormous. And that if we don't address that, we develop generations of children who may be brain compromised. Weaning onto eggs improves infant blood DHA, an important omega-3 fatty acid with its name, and iron levels. In other studies, this more rapid brain growth after birth predicts higher intelligence. That's a terribly important study. In evolutionary terms, meat, particularly organ tissues, would provide the ideal weaning food because biologically, children should be weaned onto a high-fat diet. They need the fat to build their brains. Carbohydrates are a non-essential nutrient. You don't need carbohydrates. You cannot build brains, you cannot build muscles, you can't build bones, you can't build anything apart from fat tissue from carbohydrates. And they continue, the nutrient density of complementary foods must be very high. Complementary diets in developing countries often do not contain adequate amounts of key nutrients such as zinc and iron because of lack of diversity in the diet and dependence on plant-based staples such as maize. What's missing? Meat and dairy products and eggs. That's what's missing. The recommended foods for complementary feeding should address the key nutrient gaps that are most prevalent in a particular setting. And that they should have added is the absence of meat, chicken, dairy, eggs. Meat, poultry, fish, and eggs should be eaten not once a month, not once a week, daily, or as often as possible. So in fact, once a day is not enough. if you could eat it 5 times a day, that's what that guideline says. You should eat it 5 times a day. The reason why we can eat meat easily because animals run away from us and we can digest their food easily once we catch them. It's difficult catching them. But plants evolved not to be eaten, and they have all these anti-nutrients which are designed to make sure we have struggled to digest them. And we never told that. And that's why we have to refine food, refine cereals and grains to such an extent, because we have to get rid of all these anti-nutrients. So that's the point. Better absorbed from animal sources than from plant-derived foods, because plants have evolved not to be eaten. Most foods from animal sources is more energy dense than plant-based foods because of the higher fat content and better source of fat-soluble vitamins and essential fatty acids. And when you take animal produce out of the diet, it becomes fat-soluble vitamin deficient. As I showed you, on this, a cereal-based diet is deficient in vitamins, particularly vitamin D. Animal foods are the only, my emphasis, foods that contain enough zinc, iron, and calcium and riboflavin to supply daily requirements for complementary feeding, while being low in anti-nutrients. And you see what's happened is cereals and grains have been health washed. As I said, carbohydrates were health washed, but when we replaced fat, we had to replace some cereals and grains. So we had to make out that cereals and grains were incredibly healthy.